So, David, I wonder if people think that we have been screwing up on purpose or if we're doing it for real in the beginning.
No, I
Uh,
can I can assure you all, for those listening, our screw ups are genuine and sincere. We really are as incompetent as we sound.
well, I am not David Pinsoff, and you are
Uh,
not.
I'm definitely not George Clooney, sadly.
Oh,
Uh,
oh.
okay, today
Okay, keep
we're
going
really
there.
bad at this. I'm David Pinsoff,
I'm David Pietrzewski,
and this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, which
actual
features.
evolutionary psychology
That's right.
by actual evolutionary psychologists.
That's right.
So,
Uh,
yeah.
enjoy.
David, good to see you. I'm really excited that I get to see you. I got to see you at HBES, Human Behavior and Evolution Society. Love going to HBES, and it was lovely to just spend some time with you in person.
Yeah, it was a really fun time. And after HBS, we have a wonderful guest, Annie Wertz, who is a professor of psychology at University of California, Santa Barbara. We cover some really fascinating new stuff that Annie has been pioneering on the study of infant learning and how we think about plants.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally new area, really unusual for somebody in our sort of generation of science to kind of develop a whole new area, and a really lovely example of somebody taking an evolutionary perspective on development and learning and generating completely new knowledge in an area where people really didn't think to look before, especially from a psychological experimental perspective. So it's a really fun, interesting conversation. I think you'll really enjoy it. And yeah, enjoy the episode.
enjoy.
Today we have Annie Wertz, who is a professor at UC Santa Barbara. Um, and Annie, prior to UCSB, where were you?
How far back should I go?
Uh, the snowy day. Dan told us he was born in August, so you can go back all the way to the day of your childhood. So
Well, how about I can go in reverse
sure,
and
great.
then we can go. So prior to UCSB, so I started here in March of 2024, and then prior to that, I was at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin for almost 10 years, like 9.5-ish years. That I was there. I had an independent research group called the Max Planck Research Group, Naturalistic Social Cognition. And then before that, I was a postdoc at the Infant Cognition Center at Yale. And then before that, I was actually at UCSB. So I have looped again. I was here for graduate school. With Tamsin German, and of course had Lita Cosmides and John Tooby on my committee. And then before that, I was at Boston University. And before that, I was in Robesonia, Pennsylvania, until the day of my birth.
And then before that, we don't know.
We don't know, yeah.
And we actually had Jamie Krems on, and she mentioned there's a whole bunch of people from Eastern, and apologies to Western Pennsylvania, but Eastern Pennsylvania, like apparently Lita grew up in Philly, uh, um, uh, Jamie, and Joe Henrik. And then David, do you remember who else she mentioned? Oh, Mike
Uh,
Gervin. Mike Gervin is from there.
that's right.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'll have
Mike
to have Mike
Irvin.
on. Yeah. So there's apparently she thinks there's something in the water. So congratulations on being from. It's a good pedigree. Hailing from Eastern Pennsylvania. We'll
Mhm.
get into all of that path. And one of the things we always ask people is how they got interested in evolutionary psychology. But before we do that, can you tell people a little bit about what an independent research group leader is at the Max
Mhm.
Planck, or what the Max Planck is? Because I know lots of people, our audience is diverse, may not know what that is. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, so it is it's the Max Planck Society. is the overarching institution. And in Germany, the Max Planck Society has over, I mean, I'm not sure what the current count is, but it's somewhere over 70 different research institutes throughout Germany, the EU. There had been one in Florida. I don't know if there's still one in Florida, Italy. So they're dispersed all over the place. And they all focus on different topics. And it runs the gamut from physics and chemistry to empirical aesthetics and history of science and all kinds of fascinating questions. And they build them around the particular sets of people who they bring in to be directors, who are kind of the people who are in charge of the big centers. There's usually several directors within an institute, and those are high-powered people with tons of money behind them, and research scientists, postdocs, pre-docs, the whole thing. And then their system, they have what's equivalent to an assistant professor position within that, there's several different kinds, but the kind that I had was an independent research group. So equivalent to an assistant professor position. And basically what that was is there's a call that goes out almost every year in the fall where you can apply for these positions. And you pitch a research idea that you could do for around 5-ish years. And I was successful in that application, and they gave me a bunch of money to do my work, working on how infants how infants learn about plants, but the kind of underlying psychology for how babies learn about the natural world. And so they gave me money to do that. And I had my own PhD students, I had master's students, I had a team of student research assistants. I was lucky enough to have 2 paid, a lab manager, and then a person whose position was foreign language secretary, who worked for me and were just wonderful professional science support staff. It was a fantastic position. The biggest problem with it, though, is it's time limited. So even though there's an initial 5-year period for it, then after that, you can apply for extensions of various kinds. And I did that successfully along the way. But outside of a few constrained things, typically they expect that they've given you all these resources, they expect you to move on. And so I did, and I was very lucky to then get the position here at UCSB.
Right. And so it's sort of the Max Planck thing, it's sort of a high risk, as I understand it, it's sort of, there's a high risk new question to be asked, and they give you sort of a temporary pot of money to say, look, here's this really new idea. And yep. Maybe not all of them work, but they're important, big picture, new ideas that challenge existing wisdom. And it's this really cool sort of like scientific, I don't know, what would you call that? Almost like what is it when an entrepreneur throws money at things? I don't know anything about this.
Startup?
Yeah. It's sort of like it's almost like a scientific startup or GoFundMe, or sort of like a thing of where, it's sort of an engine for like new innovative research ideas where, the ideas maybe some percentage or even high percentage fail, but then some are successful. And as far as we know, and I mean, this is whenever we have guests on, I always think about like what to say about a person. There's very few people I know in our cohort who came up with a whole new area of research. And I think you're one of those people where the combination of babies and plants, and I know it's more complicated, but we're being super reductive now. Like when people hear that, they sort of do a double take, and we can get into and sort of what that is. But I mean, but what you're saying is that, you were one of these high risk people in this really cool program in Germany. And it, by all accounts, based on the papers and based on the fact that you're UCSB, it worked, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it did.
And I think, it's another example in your work. And we've alluded to your work a bunch that, we've talked a little bit about innate versus learned, and we can get to that too. And your work is a good example of that. But we've also talked about how taking an evolutionary approach gives you new insights and questions to ask that you've never would have gotten without an evolutionary approach. And I think your work is a really good example of that, to the point where when people hear about it, it sounds like a crazy idea unless you sort of explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, to put a button on the Max Planck thing, the idea behind these independent research groups is it's really promising ideas that are potentially too new to be a sure bet for traditional funding agencies. So they give
Mm,
you the money to really establish the idea if it's got something to it. And
mm.
with the idea that later on down the line you can get money from traditional funding agencies as well. And that's how it worked in my case.
That's awesome. I wish we had
Mhm.
something like that here in the US. It sounds very cool.
Yeah.
But I want to get into the origin story behind this topic of plants because I don't think I've heard it or know how you got into this. So as
Mhm.
far as I'm aware, like you're the first person to start studying this topic. You basically pioneered this new field of research, and that raises a lot of questions like how did you discover that this was an underexplored topic? How did you uh, move in this direction? Did you slip on a plant and then like what happened there?
Yeah, well, there several things kind of came together. So when I was in graduate school at UCSB, um, I guess it sort of intersects with the origin story of how I ended up in evolutionary psychology too, because
Hmm.
coming out, I'm my kind of deep time history as a scientist is in cognitive development.
Hmm.
And that's what I was doing when I was in undergrad, in addition to working in a behavior genetics lab. Um, and so I was reading a lot of the work. This was, early 2000s. I was reading a lot of the infant cognition work that was coming out at the time. People, like Karen Wynn, Elizabeth Spelke, Susan Carey, Alan Leslie, people like that, talking about the kinds of systems you would expect to see in infant minds. And that
Hmm.
was a very it's a domain specific view that there are these different people have different flavors of this, but to use Liz Spelke's framework, there are these different core knowledge systems, right, that
Hmm.
are for different kinds of things.
Yep.
And so I had been working or thinking in that kind of way of, or I've been kind of steeped in that way of thinking. And when I applied to graduate school, I applied to work with Tamsin German here to do theory of mind work. I was very interested in kind of thinking about thinking. But one of the other things that had always grabbed me in that work is there's a whole section on folk biology and intuitive biology and the kind of common sense understanding of the biological world, which basically boils down to plants and animals, but also includes things like how kids think about disease or other kinds of biological processes.
Hmm.
There's a really interesting literature there that was very active in the late 90s and early 2000s. Um, and so I had been familiar with that work. Back when I started graduate school was the days where you were accepted and then you were brought out for a recruitment weekend. So I had been accepted to UCSB. I came for the recruitment weekend, and I was among many other interesting conversations that I had, and of course, the really good fit with my advisor. I was lucky enough to meet with Lita Cosmides, and I did not know that she was Lita Cosmides, because I
Had
knew
you heard it?
nothing.
Had you heard of her at that
No,
point? Okay,
no, because
yeah,
I
amazing.
didn't
Yeah,
know anything about evolutionary psychology, and what I had, well, that's not entirely true. The only thing I had heard about it was that it was all basically like fake and
yeah,
wrong.
garbage. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
just in
Totally.
passing, that
Yeah.
was what I had heard about it, and I
Yeah.
didn't hear enough of it to form an opinion one way or the other. Um, I just really didn't know. So
Hmm.
I came here. I was for the recruitment weekend. I was talking to Lita, and she asked me about, well, what are you thinking about? And one of the things that I had been thinking about at that point when I had been reading is, well, how do you know what domains there should be? Because there's
Hmm.
at the time there's objects, there's number, there's agency. Um, but why those and how would you carve them up? And so I said that to Lita, and she basically said, I can teach you that. And And so I came here and she did, and the
Mm.
other graduate students in the program here and my advisor. And it was, so that's, when I first got here, I knew nothing about evolutionary psychology. I
Mm.
remember, and if you ever do talk to Tamsin German in this, she can tell you. I remember going to her office early in graduate school and saying, "It feels like they're all talking a different language, and I have no idea what they're saying."
Mm.
In talking to the other graduate students here, so I had a lot of kind of catching up to do in terms of how you do an evolutionary approach. But it just seemed when Lita explained, so Lita basically gave me the short version of how you do evolutionary psychology and an adaptationist approach. And it just seemed like it must be true, right? That
Mm.
if you want to understand the structure of the mind of a particular kind of organism, why wouldn't you want to know about and use the process that built the organism as a
Mhm.
way of deriving predictions for what should be or what might be systems in the mind, right? So this
Yeah.
it just seemed like it at that broad level it had to be true, and then the question was learning how to do that.
Right.
Mm.
And so that's what I did. I was reading a ton. I was working on theory of mind. I did my dissertation on theory of mind, which is still a topic I find absolutely fascinating.
And just for
And
people who may not know, because we have a
yeah,
diverse
oh yeah,
audience,
of
what is
course.
just theory of mind is the ability to sort of,
Um,
yeah,
the theory of mind is the common sense understanding of that other people have mental states like beliefs, desires, that basically motivate their behavior, and that you can use to interpret, predict, and explain their behavior.
right.
So, you know,
It's almost it's such a weird. I remember when I first heard about theory of mind, I was like, that's weird. And I had this experience with almost everything, like vision or mechanisms. I had sort of this initial reaction of like, well, why do you need a mechanism for that? Because, and I realized in retrospect, it was, and David, I've talked about instinct blindness, where it was just
Yeah.
instinct blindness, where it seems so obvious that it just happens. Like you never even think, oh, I think about people as having mental states. But, as John and Lead, I think, wrote one time, like a bowl of oatmeal can't do that. So like,
right.
but it always felt like sort of alien. And I think like that's part of being a scientist is sort of thinking about there are these mechanisms. And that's interesting that you started out in theory of mind and thinking about mechanisms for these very obvious systems.
Hmm.
Right.
What? Yeah. What's interesting to me is that this is sort of a different entryway into evolutionary psychology than we've heard from some of our other guests who sort of
Mhm.
encountered it directly and saw the insights that it offered. This is an interesting case where you had a question that you were trying to answer, which is, how do we figure out how to carve the mind up at the joints? What is the,
Mhm.
we seems to have these intuitions about, say, minds, say, agents, number, but like, why those categories? Why not another set of categories? And that was the question that you were bringing to the table. Like, you were basically asking a deeper why question.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is that Leda is right in that really you need an evolutionary approach to even begin to answer that question. So your entry point seems to be that you were asking this question that evolutionary psychology really was the only field that had the answer to, the only way of going about answering it, and that was sort of how you entered into the field. Was that it was a way of delivering an answer to a question that you had, that you didn't even know existed.
That's right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. And it was very at the time, I don't think I quite understood how lucky I was to literally stumble into Lita's office basically to find
Hmm.
this out because, at the time coming out of undergrad and reading things and coming out of an undergrad mindset where you're reading all kinds of things and there's somebody out there who knows the answer and they're testing you on the thing and you just if you don't know it it's because you just haven't been assigned the right thing yet or like you haven't hit upon the right set of things to read, right, to basically find the answer.
Hmm.
And I was lucky that I ran into Lita and she could tell me basically the way to do this, where it's not, as you say, it's not clear how else you could go about really, really truly digging apart or really truly digging into what is why there would be certain systems in the mind, right? You
Mhm.
can dig pretty far into the details of what's there and how it's done without an evolutionary approach, but it's really hard to think about in an a priori way what should be there without an
Mhm.
evolutionary approach. Or what, I mean, should is strong, but I mean, like if you're doing predictions, what might be there, and
Yeah.
then to be able to test whether or not your predictions about that are correct. So
Mhm.
yeah, it was luck. I mean, really, it was luck that I ended up talking to Lita about it. But once it was clear, having talked to other people about the way they get to evolutionary psychology. There's usually this kind of like aha moment of like, oh
Mhm.
right, this just makes sense, and it was
Mhm.
very clear. Talking to Lita, this just made sense.
Mhm.
And then getting into the details of it, like I said, when I started talking to all these other grad students who had read all the things before I got there because they had been doing this for a year or two in undergrad, or they had made this discovery of evolutionary psychology before me, it made no sense
Mhm.
for a while as I was learning. And what I found is that, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know if this is just the perspective I came from or if this is a common experience, but what I found is that in truly learning how to do an adaptationist approach, how to do evolutionary psychology the way that I do it, I would have these moments of, okay, this completely makes sense. I get this. And then I would read more and then it would all kind of crumble apart, right? Or I'd think
Mhm.
more and it would all kind of crumble apart. And then I would have to kind of push forward and then it would kind of go back to making sense again as I was reading more things and thinking through things more deeply. And then it would kind of crumble again, right? And this is what
Mm.
I find about ideas that, these things are controversial for a reason. These things are hard for a reason. It takes to truly grasp what's going on. You really do have to do the mental work and the reading work and the thinking and talking to other people and talking things through. Because it's not the caricature of just thinking, oh, hey, back when we were living in caves, it must be like, probably we could have done X, Y, and Z, and now I'm gonna make predictions based on that. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more that goes into that. It does take actual training, and it's hard.
Yeah. I don't want to detract from the getting to plants, but just really
Yeah.
quick, the like you think you got it and then you don't. Have you
Mhm.
thought
Mhm.
about what was that? Like, do you have an idea of sort of what?
I don't know. I mean, it's something that I experience in not just in evolutionary things. It's something that with kind of counterintuitive concepts,
Mm,
Mhm.
right? Like concepts that it takes training to flip out of the way you normally think about things to overcome your instinct blindness, since you've
right.
talked about instinct blindness. It's just anything that requires reframing how you would kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, naturally approach a question.
Yeah.
It just slips in and out. I mean, I find this a lot. I teach developmental psychology now, and I find this happens a lot, excuse me, a lot with heritability, right? Or
Mm,
like genes
yeah.
and environment. Like it just takes it you can kind of get it at a surface level, and then you start thinking through another question and you realize, oh wait, this is actually very complicated, and you have to
Right.
kind of like work at training yourself and how to keep kind of different conceptual levels clear and what the boundary conditions of what you're thinking about. So it just is, yeah, it slipped in
Right.
and out.
Right. Yeah. Like
Plus
nobody would be
starting from
so, oh, sorry.
zero.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I was just like starting from zero with like I didn't know about selection pressures. I didn't know
Mhm.
about, the whole literature, like hunter-gatherer studies and behavioral
Mhm.
ecology. I didn't know that stuff. And so I was also adding these new pieces and
Mm,
adding these
right.
entire new pieces. It would help this process of really reframing how I was approaching the study of the human mind, but it would just like crumble briefly and then you
Yeah.
kind of
Mhm.
put it back together. It was,
Yeah.
anyway, that's my experience of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you had the humility to know when it was crumbling instead of sort of blundering through in an overconfident way, which I see is unfortunately a trend uh, in some corners of the internet regarding evolutionary psychology.
Right.
Oh,
It's
I'm
sort of
unaware. David, do you have
yeah.
references? I'm unaware of this. No, I'm
Oh
kidding.
yeah.
Yeah.
We've spent several episodes going through this stuff, but yeah, it's surprising to me how easy people think it is,
Yeah.
and how people think they can do it after learning about it for 2 minutes.
Yep.
There's a lot of like really lazy amateur evolutionary psychology out there. I'm not
Yep.
sure where that comes from or why people think it's so easy and it requires so little training and so little depth of thought. I mean, do you have any, is it just instinct blind? I mean, it can't just be that.
I, that's a good question. I mean, it's something I have thought about. I think it's just, I don't know. So I don't think anyone would think about becoming a cognitive neuroscientist as something you could do just by thinking about it for a few minutes, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
But that's something that's kind of, that's a method,
Yeah.
right? And I wonder if the fact that, at least from my perspective, what evolutionary psychology offers is a really rigorous, logical, theoretical framework,
Hmm.
right? And the complexity of the theoretical framework, I think, is something that um, you can overlook, right?
Hmm.
Like you
Yeah.
can't overlook that you're sticking someone in an MRI and you have to know how to like deal with the machine and the data that come out of it, and that this clearly takes huge amounts of training to figure out how to do these things the right way. And that it's something that's specialized and does require training, right? But I think when there seem to be certain kinds of theoretical structures and even certain kinds of ways of doing science that people are more likely to think are easier than they actually are. I actually find this,
Mm.
I mean, this happens sometimes with baby stuff too. I mean, because I work with babies, is sometimes people think it's just, you just do a study with babies. But that's also something that takes quite a bit of training to learn how to use that method. So I don't know, I'm not sure why evolutionary psychology falls into this category of it's easy to overlook how complicated it actually is and how difficult it actually is, but it certainly does. I
That's
don't
really
know.
interesting. I wonder, like, this is, I think, this is what Annie, you were just saying, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like, it's sort of like the difference between you drive past somebody building a bridge versus you like see somebody writing a book, and
Right.
you're sort of like the bridge thing. It's like I don't have a crane, I don't have huge things of cement. Like that seems really hard. So you can kind of see the method in the discrepancy between what you have and what is required. But for writing a book, like I think there's this trope, like everybody thinks they can write a book until they sit down and try to. And it's because all of the difficulty is abstract and hidden. And I think like one of the themes of this podcast has been like humility about how complicated things are that might seem superficially not even worthy of notice, let alone
Yeah.
consideration, let alone respect, like babies or like field work or like the difficulty of adaptationism. So it sounds like that's sort of what you're saying, is that
Yep.
the abstractness of this, maybe combined with things like, scientists who are, kind of like, oh, babies, that's not scientific, which is a different issue or a related issue. But yeah, no, I totally buy that it's the abstraction. It's this sort of silly thing of everyone who just thinks they can write a bestseller book until they sit down to the, well, it's not a typewriter anymore, but you get the proverbial typewriter. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I do think it is the kind of thing like you can do a bad version of it easily,
Oh
Hmm.
yeah.
right?
I mean, I
Like
You
think
can
all
also
of,
do a
yeah,
bad version of cognitive neuroscience easily,
yeah.
bang someone
that's
over the head
true.
with a hammer. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
Wow, I impaired your cognition. Wow, I've a
Yeah.
new
Yeah,
discovery.
that's true.
Um, um,
We once in
uh,
grad school, somebody did an MRI analysis. This is like back in the old days where you'd used an abacus, not for real, but like you had to hand code the analysis, and like the pixels were like away from the head. And so somebody like had discovered the soul. Like we joked that like somebody had discovered the soul because, there was like brain activation outside of the skull. Neuroscience joke. I'm not sure how. Yeah.
so you're learning about what has been called core knowledge or the
Yep.
intuitions that babies bring to the table when they're learning about the world. So they're not blank slates. They don't come to the world with no preconceptions and no intuitions about anything. They often
Yep.
have very clear expectations about how the world works. And there's a whole literature of studies that basically surprise babies by violating their expectations or violating their intuitions by essentially doing magic tricks for them.
Hmm.
And you can study this scientifically by looking at how long a baby will stare at something. So it's been shown that babies will look at something when they're surprised by it, and they'll look at that for a longer time, kind of puzzling over how it works. And using that simple premise, you can study all of these things about how babies think and the intuitions that babies have about the world. So you're at Santa Barbara, you're learning about core knowledge and these intuitions that we bring to the table and how babies are smarter than we think they are. At what point does the light bulb go off and you think about plants as a potential area of inquiry?
Yeah. Well, so I was going along doing my learning how to do evolutionary psychology, doing my work
Hmm.
on theory of mind, and
Yeah.
my work on theory of mind was very heavily informed by Alan Leslie's work. And
Okay.
that was a lot of, task analysis work of how do you build a successful model of theory of mind performance? How does that, and how would different models explain the kind of data that you see when you test young kids at the time on theory of mind tasks? So I was learning not only kind of these broader questions or thinking about these broader questions of what are kind of core knowledge systems and what are the set of core knowledge systems, but I was very focused on this kind of like how do you do the nitty gritty of unpacking what would successful performance look like on a particular task, right? So that was extremely useful, and that was
Mhm.
something, this was uh, what I was thinking about a lot in my day-to-day stuff. I really like theory of mind work. I should preface what I'm about to say with I really like theory of mind work. It was fascinating to think about. I learned a huge amount, and I have a huge amount of respect for the people working in the field. But at the time I was doing it, it was a hot topic and everybody was working on it. And I had the experience of submitting papers and getting the kind of like, well, this all looks great, the science is fine, but you're not adhering to my particular version
Hmm.
of theory of mind, my particular theoretical structure, so we're going to reject the paper, which, it's a standard thing that happens, but that was sort of grating on me. And at the same time, I'm sitting in on the Center for Evolutionary Psychology meetings. And at the time when I was a graduate student, I really was just sitting there. I was very shy. I did not talk for most of my graduate career. So I was just absorbing everything that was coming through. And I started going to HBES and connecting with, you know, biological anthropologists and behavioral ecologists and primatologists and seeing the kind of work they were doing. And one of the things that came up was seeing a lot of Mike Gervin's work and looking at human life history trajectories. And a lot of the focus on that, the data that he was presenting at the time was about caloric returns for hunting and kind of the age curves for when you finally start to bring in more calories than you're using through
And
hunting
when
and
is that
skill.
point? I find that fact
Uh,
fascinating and reassuring and for me in my personal life.
yeah,
What is the
As a
point where you start
40-year-old
yeah,
as
I
a
myself.
think
40
it's
year old
40s or
man? Yeah.
50s, right? I think
40s or
isn't it?
50s.
It's
Yeah,
like
that
40s.
always
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
whenever I'm
believe.
getting down on myself, like, yeah,
I know.
remember Mike Irvin's
I
work.
know.
I
Actually,
Remember the
know.
I'm really glad you
Yeah.
said that, David, because I feel the same way too. And I'm like, yeah,
And I mean, this was I'm pulling that from 20 years ago, probably at this point. But
yeah.
yeah, it was yeah, it's quite late, which is good. So but
Hmm.
he's talking about the great data that he has and the theoretical work. And at some point, or often it would be kind of mentioned like, okay, so there's this variability in the calories that come in from hunting, but the kind of basis of the diet is plants. It's gathered plant resources. Dot. Move back to hunting. And I was like
Hmm.
thinking, I'm like, oh, hang on, how do you do that? Like, what? what are the set of cognitive skills that are required to do that? Because that actually, even though it's reliable, that actually doesn't seem easy if you start thinking about it. And so that kind of grabbed my attention and I started thinking about it. And at the time, I mean, I don't know if it's like Dave and I are married. So we were both
News
here.
to me.
Yeah,
Where have I
right.
been? Yeah.
I know. I don't know
Oh,
when
Mazel
we're.
Tov!
Yes,
Congratulations.
thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks. Um, and at the time, we were, doing a lot of trail running here in
Mhm.
Santa Barbara, and so we were up in the mountains,
This was
and
before
we would.
parents, so we had time to do.
Yes, this is pre-parenting. Now we don't go in the mountains, but we had time to do these long runs in the mountains on the weekends, and we did some runs where we'd go back over into backcountry and stuff. And this is also pre earbuds and like listening to stuff while you're going. It was just quiet, and we would run with our friends. And there were a lot of times when I was out there and it was like, okay, if we got stuck this far out, I would die. But people did this. Like people did this here. They did this here successfully for thousands and thousands of years. How do you do this? And so I was just kind of thinking about all of these things, and I just started thinking through the problem. It just was interesting to me. I have always kind of liked plants. I find them interesting, and fruits and things like that. I never have gotten into being a super gardener yet, but I can see that coming someday. Um,
I see the TED Talk in your future, Annie Wertz, Plants and You, or maybe like
yeah,
I could see you writing some
maybe,
self-help book about the wisdom of
maybe,
flowers,
yeah.
something like that. I think that could bring
That'd
in
be
some money
funny.
for you.
I'll keep that in mind for the title. Thanks, David. Um, yeah, but it
Grow
was so it's
grow
just
your
like,
profits or so.
Oh
Some
oh,
yeah.
there's it's so
oh,
rife for
oh.
puns. It's
Oh,
just
so
I
many.
do. It is, and I have to say, I've used a bunch of puns in my titles because I find it. I don't know. It's
It's a
fun. This
contentious
is life
topic.
is hard enough. You might as well have
I
puns in your
know. I'm pro
titles.
pun. I'm firmly on the pro pun side. I think we need more levity in our science.
Oh
yeah.
yes,
Some people disagree with me, but I'm firmly on the side of fun and
me
puns.
too.
Yeah.
But yes, I had the luxury though of like I started thinking about that. I don't remember exactly when, but a few years into grad school, maybe 3 years in. So I had like 3 years of just thinking about this for fun while I was frustrated about theory of mind stuff. So I was thinking about theory of mind stuff. I was doing the theory of mind stuff. I was doing my dissertation. I was working on the papers for that, and just getting intensely frustrated. But then I just had the time to think, and I could. And I Then when we got our PhDs, Dave and I, he got the job to go work with Karen Wynn at the Infant Cognition Center at Yale because this was the time when she was looking at social relationship stuff and group kinds of things, and his work fit really well. And they had some money for me to come along too, but there wasn't a specific project that it was tied to. And so I had a meeting. Karen Wynn was here in Santa Barbara. I think she was a Sage Fellow or something like that. With one of our speaker series would have people stay at the time anyway, had people stay for a little bit in town. So I met with her here. And she basically asked, well, what do you want to do for your postdoc project? And it was wide open. Like it wasn't tied to a specific grant. It could be anything. And so I talked about some action perception and theory of mind kind of ideas that I had been thinking about and that I found very interesting. And they also said, but I also have been thinking about this thing that there might be design in the human mind for learning about plants. And we could look at that in babies. And I mean, this is, condensing down the conversation, but she was basically like, oh, yes, go do that. And so that's how we started working on that. She taught me how to do the actual baby studies. And this is also when Kylie Hamlin was a PhD student in the lab, and I learned a ton about how to test babies from Karen and from Kylie Hamlin, just watching her do her thing. Kylie is a baby testing master. And so I learned a ton from that and basically supplied like, here's the theoretical stuff. Here's what I think. are places here are places I think we could start that may be fruitful, huh,
Mm.
for looking at. And so we started with some of these basic questions about, a very basic level of, is there evidence that babies are sensitive to the kind of harm that plants can inflict on humans? And is there evidence that that they may have social learning systems that are set up for learning about plants? And so that was the focus of my postdoc, was kind of what basically resulted in a couple papers looking at those questions. And then it was on the basis of that work that I pitched to the Max Planck Society to say, hey, here's this new idea. There's a couple papers on this. And they said, yes, please go do this. And that's what I did for like almost a decade. And have really been lucky enough to have the opportunity to expand out into all kinds of different aspects of that question. And that's what I'm continuing to do here. But yeah, and there's a ton to do. It turns out plants are really complicated. It's very fun to think about.
Totally. I mean, so it seems like what drove you into this area was a combination of two things. One is a frustration with the sort of faddishness in social science. So, like, people were really into theory of mind. That was the hot topic, as you said, and there are big problems with entering into a hot topic area, and that you have a lot of competition. A lot of people have their own pet theories and their own pet ways of doing things. It's hard to break in. And so that is inherently limiting. So a continued frustration with that and trying to find something new that you could carve out for yourself. And the other was, I think, a glimpse of the wave of a hand. So you mentioned Gervin's work, and he was talking about how gathering plant food as a source of calories, and you just saw that and said, wait a second, what's going on there with that wave of the hand about plant food? There's a lot in there that's being dismissed, and what I really like about the evolutionary way of thinking is that it teaches you how to spot those waves of the hand and say, wait, hold on. You can't just wave your hand like there's something underneath there. There's something more complicated. It teaches you to be to have a better eye
Mm.
about what questions have not been asked, what answers have not been given, and it helps you go in a really good direction. So is that a fair characterization of how you ended up here? A frustration of faddishness and and I guess a vigilance against having, the wool pulled over your eyes, or a vigilance against just glib answers to questions that don't really get into the complexity.
Yeah, I mean, it's close. I would say that the for the first part, it makes it sound better than it actually was. I was frustrated, and I was like, because for the part about the kind of working in a fad area, it was
Yeah,
really like, uh, okay, well, I was young, so I was
yeah,
kind of like, okay, you're going to tell me that I'm not adhering to your theory. I'm going to
mhm,
go do something that nobody's done before, and I'm going to
yeah,
build my own theory. Thank you very much. Like, it was kind of like, I
yeah,
mean, I didn't say this out loud again
Mm.
because I was
yeah.
extremely shy, but that is what was that more kind of maybe juvenile motivation was behind that.
Oh,
Um,
thank goodness you had it. I like we know next to nothing about plant cognition. We know we still don't know enough about theory of mind, but I think it's good to have a diversified approach to the discovery of knowledge. We don't want to all be studying the same thing.
No,
We
it's true.
divide our labor.
I mean, I taught a grad class this past spring quarter here, and I described, and it did feel at the time it was kind of like, in doing theory of mind stuff, it was sort of like I took my ball and went home. You know what I mean? But and then for the second part, I think, I mean, I completely agree that it's looking for, well, hang on, you just passed over something there that
Mm,
is actually really complicated, and
mm,
you're exactly right. There's a vigilance for, that is a problem that
mhm,
people have been solving, and it's actually a lot more complex. I would say in Mike Irvin, I would not say he wasn't being
Oh
glib
yeah,
about
don't mean
it,
to diss Mike Irvin
Yeah,
by any
yeah.
stretch of the
No, no,
imagination. He's
no.
awesome. Yeah.
We all focus on what we
Yeah.
focus on, right? So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was the vigilance for like, oh, hang on, that is hard, right? And
Yeah.
right now that is, either it's being overlooked or it's in the bin for like, I'll deal with
Hmm.
this later, but
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
focusing on this other thing.
Hmm.
But it was very much that vigilance for like, okay, yes, this requires an explanation, and
Hmm.
how is that happening? And then critically, having been trained in how to do an adaptationist approach, it gave me the theoretical toolkit to basically be like, well, nobody's done this before in the way that in this like kind of holistic way that I'm thinking about it, or thinking, not, I mean, holistic's the wrong word, but in a focused way, right? Because
Hmm.
people have gotten to pieces of this. Like there
Hmm.
are people like Liz Cashton had some work looking in the mid 90s looking at why kids are neophobic about vegetables, right? Like why do little kids not want to eat their vegetables? And um, uh, Margie Prophet in The Adapted Mind has the whole thing about plant toxins and pregnancy. Susan Gelman had work actually looking at how young kids think about plants. Again, that was in the kind of mid 90s. This was, as I said, there's that whole intuitive biology literature, right? So
Hmm.
people had studied what do young kids think about plants, but it was, with the exception of Susan Gelman's work, as far as I'm aware, almost all of it was how are plants and animals the same, right?
Hmm.
So like
Got it. Lumping
how
them
do
together.
living
Yeah.
things work, right? And so
Yeah.
and you can learn quite a lot from that by looking at that question for plants. So like little preschool age kids, um, 3 to 5 year old kids, 4 to 6, can know things like plants like animals grow. Plants like animals can need food and water to grow. They can heal themselves after they get damaged, and they can die. Like they know these kinds of things about both sets of entities. But there again, that's another place where the evolutionary approach, you look at that and you're like, okay, sure, there's commonalities between plants and animals, but if you're thinking adaptive problem first of how are you as either a young human or even an adult, how are you engaging with these things? The way that you engage with plants is very different than the way that you engage with animals, because, and a lot of my work kind of now you've got me on puns. It stems from this, which is that it is plants are rooted to the ground, right? And because
Hmm.
plants are rooted to the ground, that's a very different thing than animals that can move around. So, like
Hmm.
the example of dangerous plants and dangerous animals, um, a dangerous spider, a poisonous snake, a, a lion, whatever, big dangerous animals, small dangerous animals, all of those things can come to you. You have to be
Hmm.
vigilant about them in different ways. A dangerous plant, you can have a poison oak plant that you're going to get a horrible rash, or you can have a deadly toxic plant that if you take a bite of it, you will die. But none of that happens unless you go to the plant,
Hmm.
right? So even though the danger of injury or the danger of death is there in both cases, it's very different how it plays out. So if you're thinking about how systems should be designed to deal with those dangers, they likely have different characteristics and different design features. And so that's where I really that's how I started thinking about that too. So there's pieces in the literature, but not from the standpoint of what are the broader adaptive problems really of humans dealing with plants, and how would you see what would the cognitive systems for those kinds of problems look like in babies and in young kids.
Right. So
Well,
it's that instead of all the infinite ways you could carve up plants as a thing sort of in a school book, it's thinking of this privileged class of what would there be selection pressures for
Right.
people. And I mean, one of the things that whenever I see your talks is that the first few slides are sort of, the way that we think of plants now is this sort of backdrop and wallpaper, but that's
Mhm.
very unusual. And our brains are really evolved for this world where we didn't have grocery stores and where everything really is, you have to go out and actually like get food, and that is
Yep.
super not trivial. As you said, like I'm sure all of us would die. Probably Annie, you would probably survive the longest of the three of us. David, I don't know. Who do you think if we were in the wilderness, who would go first?
Oh, I would go first,
Okay.
definitely.
I didn't want to say it, but I don't know. We'll see.
We've been through
Hopefully
this
we'll
many
never.
times. Every time we bring on an anthropologist, I'm like, shivering with fear, like when they describe what they've been through.
Yeah. But yeah, but no, but the point of like, you really, this thing of affordances, right? Like, what does this thing afford? And we had Ed Hagen on already too, and he talked
Mhm.
about how like this these secondary compounds, these pesticides, like there's just a ton of these chemicals, and I just love that,
Yep.
this your talks are incredibly logical in the sense of plants, even though they look like wallpaper, are fundamentally important. They literally are like in life and death for
Yep.
eating and also other stuff like, construction. But then they're super, super dangerous. And I think even as much as I thought I appreciated just hearing all the details from you about even like tomatoes, like the leaves of the tomato plant, it's like a deadly nightshade family. So even though it's been
Yeah.
artificially selected, even though, it's still, yeah, it's still like super dangerous, right? Like plants are
Mhm.
just super dangerous.
Yeah. Don't eat tomato leaves. Don't eat potato leaves. Don't eat raw potatoes also.
Yeah, don't eat raw potatoes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is what's it's plants are really complicated, and it's always very interesting to talk to people about this because when I give the few word description of I study babies and plants, Dave's right, everybody goes, huh? And I mean, now it happens less because I've been doing it long enough that people sort of expect that. And sometimes now they go, oh, you're the one. But there's usually kind of like, well, I get asked a lot of things. One thing I get asked a lot is, what were you really looking for when you found this? It's something I get asked that a lot. And I say, well, I was looking for this. Like I started out, I mean, I was thinking about this for literal years before I started looking for this. And then the second thing is kind of a, oh, well, okay, maybe I guess, but people have this idea very much built on their own experience that plants are just like not that important.
Hmm.
And then when you start to get people thinking about, first of all, as Dave mentioned, in worlds where people are living in wild environments and you can't go to the grocery store, you can't go to a restaurant. How are you going to get your plant foods, right? You have to go out and you have to actually identify these things, but plants are really tricky because they all have, as you heard from Ed, they all have these toxic secondary compounds in them. Um, they all have toxic secondary compounds, and then some of those exist in forms and in concentrations that can be really bad for humans. And Ed probably talked about how we have enzymatic pathways. There's all kinds of defenses that we have against plants. Like our physiology is really adapted to these things, and not just us, but existing off of wild forage plant resources, this is something that applies to all kinds of other animals, arguably most other animals, right?
Right. If you were to
And
do like a pie chart of likely selection pressures,
yes,
plants, contrary to the intuition, like is probably the most certain stable feature that like animals have been, dealing with for really, really long time, well prior to whatever what mammals, I mean, right? Like even
yeah, I mean,
fish,
yeah,
Yeah.
insects do
Yeah.
this, right?
insects. Yeah.
Most of
Yeah.
plants is like plants and insects. And
Hmm.
it's a really long-standing problem. And so I think, I mean, the one of the benefits of also doing this and starting this in my 20s is I just knew this had to be true, right? Like it now, I think I'd be more risk averse, and even if I knew
Mm.
it had to be true, I don't know that I would either counsel my students or allow myself to just like, no, no, just go do a whole new area based on this logic that you have, right?
Hmm.
But it had to be true. Why would an entity that lives off of these things out in the world, like
Yeah.
even just if you take the fundamental that just like consumes these things, eats these things, why would there not be psychology for engaging with plants? How could there not be psychology for the kind of thing, one of the main kinds of things that this kind of organism exists on, right? And
Yeah.
so from that perspective, it had to be true. So I started doing it with the certainty that, I might be wrong about the details, right? So I
Hmm.
might be wrong about the way that the psychology is set up to deal with plants. That's entirely possible. I don't think I'm wrong that the psychology is set up to deal with plants,
Right.
Hmm.
right? In some
Right.
way. Like some aspects of human psychology must be set up to deal with plants.
Yeah.
Maybe not the way I think, maybe not the way I've interpreted my data, but there should. It's a good place you should. Like there should be something there for that. If an insect is set up that way, if a gorilla is set up that way, why not humans?
Right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
so it seemed like a
Yeah.
safe bet. And I mean, it's worked out, but it was in retrospect, like later on in my postdoc career, I had a kind of passing conversation with Paul Bloom, who was kind of a co-advisor at the time. And he said something like, "Yeah, this was actually brave to do this." I thought, and it was the first time I thought about it, and I was like, "Oh no, this would have been a huge mistake." But yeah, it ended up working out. Um,
Yeah.
All right. So you took this leap of faith. Well, it's a more of a leap of logic, I think. I think there's really
yeah,
rigorous and solid logic, so I don't think it was a leap at all. And so after you take this leap and you do this brave thing of, you know, walking out onto a new field, another plant metaphor, 10 years later or so, you have harvested, another plant metaphor, a lot of empirical
nice.
evidence. Um, could you give us a sketch of some of the discoveries you found, some of the design features of this system? What have you learned in the past decade or so?
Yeah, sure. So the overarching thing is the that fundamentally because humans are here, let me just step back. So the logic, the core of the logic about the design of plant systems is that a large portion of what is going on in humans is likely to involve social learning, right? And
Hmm.
the reason for this is because, so as we've talked about, plants are many things. They are edible, but they are also dangerous, and they can be that in very specific ways. So, in most cases, plants are only edible, or like it's certain parts of plants are edible at certain times of the year, basically, because that's, how that's not entirely the case, but that's how it works. For humans, we also do this thing where we process our food and we cook our food. And so that unlocks a lot of plant resources that are otherwise toxic. So there's a lot of things, the kinds of foods that humans specialize in, like fruits, roots, and nuts. A lot of the roots and nuts that humans rely on and that are the kind of staples of human diets. If you look in small scale indigenous societies, you see that they're plant resources that are not edible unless you do some kind of processing to them. So they're toxic until they're processed, and then they are food, and they are these staple kind of core basis of the caloric intake. Um, so what that means, though, is that as a human being, when you're born, you're basically dropped into a particular environment. You can't know in advance what the plant life around you is going to be.
Hmm.
So because we are omnivores and we don't specialize in like one or two particular plants like some species do, you can't build in something that's more like a template for like find this particular plant. And if you find this particular plant or this particular features of plants, then you're fine, go ahead and eat it. We're not set up that way. We have this large diet breadth, and because we specialize in these higher caloric density parts that require processing beforehand, it means that any individual human can't construct a human diet on their own, right? So if you as a baby are born into a particular place, if you were by trial and error to kind of just even figure out which plants are around you are edible, and you just start eating particular plants and seeing what happens based on what happens to you when you eat it, at best, you're going to spend a lot of time sick, and out of commission. At worst, you're going to die. And so instead, what you see, and now I've done this with some collaborators, is when you run selection dynamic models, when you run the math on this, these circumstances select for the evolution of social learning mechanisms, where instead of trial and error learning the information for yourself, instead the mechanisms are set up to learn the information from the people in your local environment who already know it, right? So I know, and this is one of these places where there's a little bit of a gloss over, like it does gloss over how do you get that knowledge in the first place, right? Like, and this is clearly there is a process there by which the first individual figured out that you could eat this, and then the individuals along the way across generations figured out, for example, the processing techniques and things like that that you could do, and you have this kind of cumulative cultural evolution of these kinds of these aspects of things. For right now, for me, that stuff is black boxed, right? I know it's there. I know it's something to be explained, but I'm assuming that that is there. And then given that babies are dropped into a world where that exists, then the argument is that their psychology, particularly our psychology, human psychology, especially when we're in the earliest parts of our lives, is really geared towards getting that information from watching what other people do, right? So, so what we have found is, at a broad level, is that infants show evidence of a psychology that is designed for balancing the costs and benefits of plants, such that when infants are first confronted with unfamiliar plants, they show a reluctance to reach out and touch plants compared to other things. So we do this by, we test babies with a series of different objects. We have real plants, we have artificial plants that look very realistic, but we include them for two reasons. And first, we include them because they don't grow or change or die over the course of testing, and the real plants do. And then secondly, we include them because they don't have a scent, and the real plants do. And scent is important, but when we were testing this, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just getting babies responding to stuff that smelled one way versus things that don't smell at all. So we have real plants, artificial plants, and then we make a bunch of control objects to examine whether babies are responding to plants per se, or are they responding to particular features? Like, is it a broader class of anything that's green, or anything that has particular kinds of shapes? So we build these artifacts. I don't have any in my office, or I would pull one over. But we build these artifacts that share features of the plants, but when you see them, especially up close, they are definitely not plants. We also include familiar objects that are both things that babies would use all the time themselves, like little board books, and then objects that would also be things that parents would caution babies about using. So we have like cooking pots, we have a knife. It's a infant safe 3D printed knife, but it is a knife, and other kinds of objects like that. And then we have another category of stimuli that are other inanimate natural kinds that are not plants. So shells, stones, like a dried out sea sponge, these kinds of things, so that we can examine whether it's a broader category potentially of natural versus human made, right? So we have this whole set of different objects, and we put them down in front of infants one at a time in a randomized order. And then what we see is that infants take longer to reach out and touch the plants versus all of the other object types we tested. So we see this plant-specific response.
Hmm.
They treat the real and the artificial plants similarly, and show this reluctance to touch. And
Hmm.
we've replicated that now, I think, 7 times in
Okay.
different contexts, including some work with collaborators looking at indigenous small-scale societies, where we see aspects of this also in those societies as well. And what we see in addition to that initial reluctance to touch is, at least in the US and the German populations that we've looked at, in the time before babies touch, they actually look up to the adult to see. The way we interpret that is it's a if you are geared to get social information, you have to look at the person to see what they're doing, right?
Hmm.
So in these studies, the adult experimenters across the table from the baby, they put these stimulus objects down, and what we see is that if you, on my computer screen, if you're the experimenter and you hand me the baby an object, if it's a plant, what I do is I look to you first, and then I will go ahead and try and touch it. If it's one of these other non-plant objects, I'll touch it first, and then I'll look to you to see what to do. So we see this kind of like social information gathering thing. And then we also have evidence that, in addition to looking for social information prior to making contact with plants, we see that babies appear to be geared to learn that particular plants are edible. So we see kind of selective learning of plant edibility. We see that that information that babies learn about plants is when it's generalized to new things. They're really careful about how they generalize information about plants, especially edibility information. They seem to generalize that more tightly than they do, say, toxicity information. And when they're
Hmm.
generalizing just information like name information about plants, they use, or when they're generalizing name information when it's about a plant, they focus on these little fine-grained features more than when it's a human-made artifact. So we see
Hmm.
that there seems to be, because one of the thinking adaptive problem first, one of the problems is, after you learn about a particular plant in your environment, you have to be able to apply that information in new settings. And
Hmm.
because many plants look very similar, and they have that high cost of making a mistake, as even
Hmm.
very similar looking plants, one can be edible, one can be toxic,
Right.
it suggests that there should be selection on the mechanisms to use all available features to make these kind of fine-grained distinctions. And we're
That's
seeing
fascinating.
some evidence about of that in babies,
Hmm.
and some in adults too. So that's kind of like, that's a gloss, but that's kind of the big picture at this point. Initial reluctance, evidence of looking for social information, and then gathering social information in specific ways, and then generalizing that information in specific ways as well.
Fascinating. I mean, it makes good logical sense, what you're talking about, because with a physical artifact like, say, a chairs vary quite substantially in terms of how big they are, their shape. Any man-made artifact or human-made artifact can have different have you know vary in size. But what is constant is the function. Like, what is the purpose? Chairs are for sitting, and hammers are for hammering nails. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect such a focused attention on the details of a physical artifact if you want to learn how to use that artifact or what its function is. But with plants, on the other hand, the tiny subtle details actually matter a great deal in terms of differentiating one plant from another plant. With a plant, size, shape, texture really is hugely important, and could mean the difference between getting sick or dying, and eating something that is edible. So I think that's a really fascinating example of how fine-grained the learning psychology is. I also think it's fascinating how laser specific these mechanisms are. So it's not just green things, it's not just pointy
Right.
things, it's not just sharp things. It's a like really the specific features of a plant are what's triggering this psychology and this reluctance to touch, this curiosity about what other adults think of this thing and whether they think it's safe. It's truly fascinating. Given that you've gathered all this evidence about this, seemingly laser-focused psychology on plants, how would you refer to this system, this collection of mechanisms? I know you and Dave have written a lot about modularity and how you don't like that term.
Yeah.
To me, this sounds like maybe module is a good way of thinking about it. If it's not a module, what is it? How do you talk about this system?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I think about it is that what I'm looking at is a collection of sort of related but overlapping systems, right? So I think about this as there are systems, what I've called them to have kind of a single label for everything that I'm doing is that I'm looking at a collection of systems for plant learning and avoiding natural toxins or plant systems.
Hmm.
But I don't think about this as there is a single module for plants, right?
Hmm.
First, because I think that, as I mean, probably you've discussed with Dave, I think that the use of module and modularity gets tied up in implications of Fodorian modularity, and I
Hmm.
certainly do not mean that.
Right.
I
Just in
Which is
would
reference
just,
go,
to the,
yeah,
yeah,
just Jerry Fodor, who was funny, scathing, and pretty controversial philosopher of mine at Rutgers, who was actually a colleague of Alan Leslie's, right? Is that
yeah,
right,
I
Annie?
think
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
But he basically, the idea is like a module. I don't know how much we talked about what Fodor meant about module, but basically the idea is like sort of that it's things that are you as like an intuitive agent can't control, like seeing an illusion is a classic example. Like, that two lines in an illusion, you've measured them with a ruler, they're both the same length, but you can't help but see them as different length because of the other parts of the scene. And so the idea is something like visual perception is modular in the sense of like you, the little person in your head who has sort of beliefs, desires, goals, to throw back to theory of mind, like that theory of mind parts of you can't control something. And so for
hmm
Fodor, that was I mean, there's a whole other, there's a whole paper on it you can read, but basically the idea is like Fodor had a reason for differentiating like the stuff you, quote unquote, the little person can control versus those other things. Evolutionary psychology really never meant that evolved stuff are those things that you can't control, but it
hmm
kind of got tied together. And David and I did talk about sort of like the way people misunderstand it and how they often want to compartmentalize it to some things. And it is
Yeah.
often the things you can't control. And even in the podcast and popular spaces, that's often the way it's sort of framed is like there's you, and then there's like this additional stuff where it's not coming from you, but it's coming from evolution. And so I think it's a
hmm
very prepotent thing, but that I just wanted to fill in like that's the Fodorian version, but what Annie's saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying like that's not what you're talking about here.
That's right. And I mean, there's even if you read the if you read Fodor's work, there's even like a list of criteria
hmm
that a system has if you're claiming that it's modular, and it's things like
Yeah.
fast, automatic, encapsulated, da, 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 da. And as Dave said, when evolutionary psychologists talk about modularity, they're talking about a functionally specialized system, right? And
hmm
maybe it's fast, maybe it's slow, maybe it's automatic, maybe it's not, maybe it's encapsulated, maybe it's not. It's the
Yeah.
George Williams adaptationism, the
Right.
form follows the function, right? And
Yes.
it depends on the function, on the problem the thing is designed to solve, the function that it
Yeah.
has. Those are the design criteria it has. It's Clark
hmm
Barrett's thing of it depends, right?
Yep.
Right.
And that's why I would not say it's a module. Well, that's why I would say it's not a module, right? I would say that I'm looking at systems that are functionally specialized around the problems that people face with respect to plants. And you may also hear I'm also saying there's multiple, right? So I don't
Mm.
think that there is just one problem with respect to plants. And I also find just in thinking through doing the task analysis and making predictions about the design that and again, this is maybe where my approach to this might be wrong and potentially leading me astray, but I find it easier to think about, that there are at at best there's sort of subcomponents to the
Hmm.
problem of plants, but more
Yeah.
likely I think there are the problems, the adaptive problems, uh, are to some degree distinct within plants. And I think there's also areas where the problem that I'm thinking of from the perspective of being interested in plants is actually larger than just plants,
Hmm.
right? So like there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of things for foraging, for example, for plant foraging, that it's probably actually a larger category of stationary resource foraging, which would
Hmm.
include things like honey, and it would include things like probably marine life, aspects of marine life.
Hmm.
And so then a psychology designed for that, it's not really plant specific, but plants, there would be a lot of overlap. You could get to thinking about that psychology from starting with plants and then seeing commonalities with other things. So when I think about the systems that I'm studying, I really do think that it's a fuzzy set of cognitive mechanisms that have overlap with these other systems and other problems,
Yeah.
that are, functionally specialized for those problems. And so in a way, it's an unsatisfying answer because it's complicated, right? Like it
Yeah.
basically comes down to it's complicated, but the way that I approach it in my science and the way that I prefer, the way that I just like to think about it because I'm interested in thinking about plants is I think kind of the plant problems first, right?
Yeah.
And then seeing that there is often overlap with other things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's actually a beautiful example of how you wouldn't necessarily expect a well-designed system for solving the problem of finding edible plants and avoiding toxic plants. You wouldn't expect that system to be fast, automatic, and encapsulated from the rest
Right.
of cognition. In fact, if it was, it would serve its function extremely poorly. You want to be open to other kinds of social information. You want to be looking at the social cues you get,
Yeah.
the mental states that you can infer other adults around you are having with regard to the plant. If they're making a grossed out face or a fearful face, that's going to be important information that should feed into the system. So there's a rich variety of information that this learning system should be connected to. And it doesn't necessarily need to be fast or automatic. And what the modularity, the Fodorian modularity approach, I think misleads us into doing is to thinking that adaptations have one shape, or
Yes.
that instead of looking at what is the actual problem that needs to be solved and what is the best way to solve it, and then just abandoning all your preconceptions about what a good solution would be, and just looking at how would you actually solve this in practice in a way that would be fitness promoting.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so
that's exactly right. That's like, I mean,
yeah.
we used to, Dave and I don't, we've kind of moved away from this, but we used to call that binning, like
Yeah.
that it
Yeah.
would like create, it was like, it's calling something module, it like puts it in the module, calling something modular, it puts it in the module bin. And then by
Yeah.
virtue of being in the module bin, then it entails all of these different criteria. And then
Yeah.
people try to say, well, this thing, you're claiming it's an adaptation and you're saying
Yeah.
there's a module. And then so you have to show all of these things in
Yeah.
Fodor's list, right? And
Yeah.
as you said, that's from an adaptationist perspective, that's just kind of the wrong way to go about it because the
Yeah.
form follows the function. So it's really thinking about what is the problem, what are the design features that could solve the problem, and then test for the presence of those design features. And if there's evidence for them, great. If there's not, then you've made an error somewhere along the way. You can
Yeah.
falsify your predictions and you can go back and really think about the structure independent of kind of having to worry about whether you've ticked all the boxes for
Yeah.
that particular bin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another downside of this is that it distracts us into having this really silly and pointless debate about
Yeah.
whether something counts as a module. Like
Yes.
that is the absolutely the wrong question that we should be asking and the wrong debate to be having.
Yeah.
It's what we should be asking is how the mind works, how it solves the particular problems that we know that our ancestors would have needed to solve to survive and reproduce, and just going about and figuring out how those systems work.
Yeah.
Uh, Whether something, fits some definition of a module is just the wrong question to be asking, and it's a distraction.
Exactly. That's
So,
exactly right. And
yeah,
and in addition to that, with my work, the fact that what I'm predicting is an evolved learning system
Hmm.
Yeah.
is something that I hope is a contribution of this work, because you have in many areas of psychology you have a misconception that evolved things are somehow opposite. Evolution is the opposite of learning, right? That
Right.
either
Hmm.
it's evolved or it's learned. And I think it does
Hmm.
come in part from this Fodorian from thinking that things follow Fodorian modularity, right? So that there
Yeah.
can't be learning if you have a Fodorian module, but for an evolved system, there's no reason that part of the design can't be learning. And in
Hmm.
fact, there should be learning here. And
Right.
then of course there's the whole, you talk to Christina Moya, I mean there's the
Yeah.
whole, there's big research traditions within the evolutionary social sciences about this, but it's not clear that that information makes it out into the wider world, or at least to the other scientific communities that I care very much about and have a lot of contact with. That you know, evolution and learning are not in conflict. Evolution can design a learning system.
Right.
Yeah.
And even needs to, right? I mean, like
Yeah,
even the point
Yeah.
of just, even just as David said, the specifics of the plants, right? And like the whole point of your research as you're saying is that and I like what you're saying because there's like kind of two things. One is like in its affordance base, like, as you talked about, like it's something can hurt you, you can eat it. And so you're privileging all the ways to categorize a research program into what are likely the evolutionarily relevant affordances. And people just weren't looking at these things psychologically or developmentally. But then it's also respecting the entity itself. And plants have specific properties, right? And so that combination of like respecting the entity and its properties and the affordances that are evolutionary, it's that combination that I think it's very striking that that's sort of like the North Star of the work you're doing, and it's really interesting. You alluded to some of the affordances or like the different systems. Like what do humans, for people who might not have thought about this, like what do humans use plants for other than food and occasionally failing to misidentify a toxic plant and sources of death. Like,
mhm.
so other than like having a full stomach or dying, what else do plants provide people? I mean, I know, I'm sure people have some intuition, but maybe not, especially if they're not talking to like human behavioral ecologists who are
Yeah.
out in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about humans in a hunter-gatherer world and you're thinking about making a living in a world where you need to gather all of your food, you need to get all of your food, and also you need to make all the stuff that enables your life.
Mm,
Plants are a huge part of that as well. So
Hmm.
plants are a huge part of human material culture. Plants don't fossilize, or they don't fossilize the same way. They are preserved in the archaeological record in the same way a lot of other things are. So um, things like ropes and baskets and clothing and like shelters and the uh you see all this you see all of the spear points, but you're missing like the wooden spear, right?
Hmm.
That's that the point made it, but the spear didn't. And when you read the literature, the people who are looking in the archaeological record for plants, this is something that comes up a lot. That you have these issues of like it just can be it's not preserved in the same way. But if you look at modern populations and people living in societies today that's still use subsistence practices that include hunting and gathering and small scale horticulture, you see plants are used to build all kinds of different things. They're also used for their underlying chemical properties. So there's a lot of kind of medicinal plant use. And there's a lot of using plants for ritual things and making dyes and making face paints and making making the things you make pretty.
Hmm.
So there's kind of like these it's maybe it's not right to call it exactly functional uses versus more kind of decorative uses, but there is that as well. So yeah, plants get used for pretty much everything.
Yeah, interesting folk chemistry, or maybe not even folk chemistry, just sort of different cultural. I mean, that's a really interesting thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Mike Gervin, like one of the things that the Chimane use is they do barbasco fishing. So there's a plant that you use that you poison the river with the plant, and then that kills the fish, and you get the fish out of the river.
Right.
So
Hmm.
there are
And
and
you can
there's
eat the
plants.
meat, right? Like that's important too, right? It kills the fish in a particular way such that
Yeah.
you don't, I think that they suffocate,
Yes, they
but it's
suffocate it.
but it doesn't, the
It
poison
stops the
doesn't,
oxygen uptake in
yeah,
the gills, I think, or something
yeah.
like
But I mean, it's
that.
just such a lovely example, right? Of like, it's so improbable, and it is across this diffuse like trial and error thing, or just like social learning as you're putting it. But I just love that example of like even the way it kills the fish. you know Somebody, I guess, had to take that first little bite, to be like, I guess it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so and people use plant toxins to poison arrows for hunting. So I mean, we are an ingenious bunch, us humans, and people exploit plants. Even you have a plant that part of it is toxic, part of it is edible. The edible part is eaten, the toxic part is used
Hmm.
for something else. But
Interesting.
there's also interesting things about for when you look at the kinds of plants that are eaten. There, this literature, maybe Ed Hagen might know, probably knows more about this than I do, but the number of edible plants that or the number of plants that are in fact edible in an environment is usually a lot higher than the set of plants that people in that particular environment eat.
Mm.
And and so you could think about that. That's kind of, that could be evidence for these social learning systems, like shunting people in particular ways. There's probably also the kind of cultural learning, cultural evolution part of specializing in the plants that end up having the highest nutritional yield
Hmm.
over time. And so I think there's something very interesting there to be dug into. That yeah, one of the things in my bin of at some point I'm really interested in looking into what's going on with that.
Yeah, and that's also a reason. I mean, just talking about like the stuff that you can eat, the other materials could be used for like material construction. That would be another reason for it to not be modular in this quote unquote encapsulated way, which is that
Hmm.
as you're interfacing with this object, what are all the other affordances sort of as a byproduct, is like you're just like tearing apart this thing to get the food. Well, what are the other things that this thing could afford, right? Like, I mean,
Right.
evolved organisms are really non-entropic, and so plants, like, um I guess, I mean, like, I'm sitting on a wooden building, essentially, right? Like, like, we're many of us, like David, would fall through the floor right now if it wasn't for the fact that
Yeah.
trees have selection pressures to like grow tall, right? And that's what makes wood strong. So like
Right.
there's all these
I don't
non
think this is wood. Just you
well,
have the
I
same background
realized,
that I
yeah.
do.
I'm actually realizing this is like a veneered
Yeah,
table I'm
I
sitting
mean,
on. Yeah,
we have
exactly.
similar offices. I
Yeah,
don't know. Maybe
concrete
the
block.
door is
Yeah,
wooden. But
yeah.
I mean,
So, well,
yeah, the
actually,
point
it's
is,
not.
yeah. But the point is right. And this is where I think so because I was starting with infants and because I wanted to start with the very, very basic questions of looking at uh, avoiding danger, learning that it could be eaten, there's this whole category of thing of how do plants intersect with artifact psychology and actually the building and making of artifacts, because artifact psychology is very interesting. It was something that, again, that was a big research focus in the late 90s, early 2000s. Is a really fascinating topic. It's kind of fallen it's fallen by the wayside a bit in the scientific literature, but it's really interesting to think about how plants factor into artifact psychology and how using materials from plants. And also, this is an area where this is wider than plants, right? If you've killed an animal and you are butchering the animal for meat, you also see all of these parts inside of that thing that you can use and people do use
Right.
for all kinds of different things. And so this is where the overlap between, I think about it from plants, but if you're thinking about how to build artifacts and the psychology for building material culture in a hunter-gatherer world, there's probably a huge overlap in that between plants and animals and in how that psychology is set up. And
Right.
be very interesting to look at.
Yeah, it's a very cool way to think about like our evolved architecture, where it's sort of like we have this. I mean, I at least have this idea, sort of even now, like of sort of like there's people who specialize in like carpentry, or there's like chemists or physicists, and like there's just these different things. But like we have software for doing chemistry and physical construction, and like thinking about artifacts. And I think if you watch kids, or like even think about like I love playing with like I even like randomly, I don't know if you guys did this, but like when I would talk to my friends and I would just be out in the woods, I would just like grab a stick and just peel the bark off randomly. Like it's almost like there's this placeholder
Mhm.
for like processing plants as just one of the repertoire, behavioral motor repertoires of what we do, even to the point where I'll just do it even when it's for no purpose. It's such an interesting thing to think about, where there is this discrepancy between sort of this job has been taken care of for us
Right.
by the division of labor in a modern environment, but yet the software still exists in us. And maybe to
Yeah.
the extent we don't understand it, we're actually possibly not doing as well as we could be. Like that's another
Yeah.
thing. I know you're starting to think about also like food and nutrition,
Yes.
and just also like there are consequences of this mismatch that are both health and physical, and also maybe mental. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the what you describe of being a kid and walking through the woods and actually engaging with plants and with the natural world around you, that's kind of the being immersed in the natural world and growing up having this rich first person experience, not only with the natural world, but with watching other people who have this rich knowledge,
Yeah.
manufacturing the kinds of things you need to survive, getting
Hmm.
the food you need to survive, processing the food you need to survive. All of those things are things we're just really missing.
Yeah.
And with respect to food, the way that I have looked at plant edibility so far with babies is largely with showing them an adult. Sometimes it's been Dave acting in my stimuli, but then after Dave, it was my students in Berlin.
Mm.
But picking a piece of fruit off of a plant and sticking it in the mouth, right? And that is a cue of edibility. And it seems to be something that uh, plants are selectively seen as edible, even if you show babies somebody eating a piece of fruit off of a plant and then eating a similar thing off of a human-made object, they'll make the inference that the plant is edible, even though the action is the same. So the social information is processed differently when depending on what is being acted upon. But the thing about plants, it's true that there are plants that where you can pick stuff off of it and eat it. But like I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of plants where you can't eat it until you do a lot of other things to it first. And so not only do you as a human need to learn that this plant is edible, you also need to learn all of the things you need to do to make it edible in order to feed yourself and your family and the other people in your community. And so oftentimes babies are just like along for the ride for foraging, right?
Right.
When they're really little, they're carried along for foraging. When children get a little bit older, they are tend to be kind of together in these multi-age groups of kids running around, but there's still those little groups of kids go out and do their own foraging. Karen Kramer gave a great talk at
Yeah.
CWES recently
Yeah.
at a conference we had here recently, detailing all the ways that kids do this kind of foraging. That I would encourage people to go look up what Karen Kramer has written about this,
Yeah. We
and
should have
also
her on
people
too.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, like Sheena Lulevy is working on this. There's really great work, and Barry Hewlett, of course, has all of this work on hunter-gatherer children in childhoods. And that
Right.
was something that had not been a big focus of the research for a while. But there now is starting to be some very, very interesting, great work looking at what kids actually do. And this also includes that they're doing it themselves with their multi-age peers, but they're also around while their parents are processing these various food items. And so what my work suggests is the littlest babies, their initial response to unknown plants is to kind of avoid them, right? As a way of avoiding exposure to these potentially dangerous toxins until they have some information about how to proceed. But if you have this psychology that's basically like, just don't engage with this thing until you have the social information that it's safe, until you have the social information that it's edible. If
Right.
you're in a world where you're not getting the social information in the
Right.
correct form that this thing is safe and this thing is edible, it leads you to places like we see a lot where you have a lot of very young kids who will not touch vegetables,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that it's a big struggle, and it makes sense that you would have kids as they are developing their own motor skills and their own independence. This is what Liz Cashton talked about, that it would make sense that you would ramp up this neophobia, this food neophobia
Right.
for these potentially dangerous things in the environment. But in hunter-gatherer kinds of situations, in these small-scale societies in which our brains evolved, you would see the information that would show you, no, no, this is the thing. Like this is the thing we're processing. This is the thing that everybody's eating. This is the thing that's being gathered. And the way we feed kids today, we basically like plunk them down at a table and we give them food that's already prepared that just looks like messes of colors and shapes, and oftentimes is different than what the adult is eating because it's the kid food as
Right.
opposed to the adult food. And they haven't seen how it gets there. And you're like, no, no, trust me, it's food, just eat it. And you end up fighting this battle of getting a small child to accept something where potentially from their mechanisms perspectives, they're like, why are you feeding me poison? Right.
Right. Right.
So,
Right. Right.
this is one of the areas now. I almost have my lab built here in Santa Barbara. And one of the things that I'm very interested in doing going forward is to really start unpacking what is the entirety of the set of cues of food learning, of how
Mm.
something becomes food. And this is some work that I've already started doing with my former postdoc and now collaborator, Camille Rioux, who is in a research center in Dijon in France. She and I have started doing some initial work looking at food processing and how infants respond to signals that somebody has it previously interacted with a food. And we have a paper we're working on getting out the door now with my former PhD student, Carola Schlegelmilch, and former postdoc as well, looking at what babies do when they actually see somebody cutting up a novel plant
Mm.
food with a knife versus eating it versus a control action of just touching it, but not in a way that processes it.
Right.
Interesting. Another question I would be interested in is if once they see an adult preparing a particular food, do they generalize to other adults or do they want that same adult to prepare the
Yeah.
food? Because I have this problem with my daughter. Whenever I bring her food, she says, "No, I want mama to do it. I want mama to pour me the milk." Like, what? It's the same milk.
Is it
You
that,
think she's a
David?
better
Are you?
pourer than me, or like?
Is she saying you're a bad cook, or are you just cutting up carrots? Maybe you're a bad
So,
cutter.
like,
Is that? Yeah.
presumably at some point she saw, my wife preparing the food, and she knew that like she didn't die when she ate that food, so she's not going to take a risk on me, I guess. I
I don't know. She might have things to say about your cooking, huh?
don't know. Oh yeah, maybe.
No, but it is really interesting. I mean, this is my colleague here, Zoe Liberman, has
Yeah.
been looking at social inferences based on food, right? Like so based
Mm.
on what people eat, but it is in and it's very clear that because for humans food is social, there
Yeah.
are a lot of social inferences that you can make based off of what people are eating and food
Yeah.
sharing and things like this. And Ashley Thomas has some work touching on this as well, of people who are like well, people who are getting like their saliva and food and things like that.
Mhm.
But it would be fascinating to actually look at what happens when you have different kinds of people giving different kinds of information about food. And you could expect, for example, that information about whether something is toxic or not, it might not matter who's telling you that. Right.
Hmm.
So like if
Right.
somebody who is in some kind of out group role for lack of a better term tells you you will die if you eat this thing, you might just accept that information no matter what. But if it's something more nuanced about how a food is prepared or something about how you build a particular artifact, something like that, that might matter a lot, who it is that's telling you what's going on there. So yeah, that's something that would be fascinating to look at.
We'll eat your
Have you
cooking,
thought?
David. We'll eat your cooking.
Okay, good. That'll make me feel better because yeah, my daughter has insulted me one too many times, so I could use an ego boost. Um, Another thing that occurred to me, have you thought about how emotions might interface with this system? Because
Mm.
as I've been reflecting on this, it seems like this would be, a really good domain for disgust to be involved in because this is, a contaminant. It could involve toxins and poisons and make you sick. But just reflecting on it in terms of the phenomenology of it, disgust isn't really the emotion I
That's
feel
right.
when I think about a toxic plant. It's not really analogous at all to when I think about like rotting garbage or feces or something like rotting meat, um,
Exactly.
which is really interesting to me. And it
Mhm.
ties into what you were saying before about all the different things that we use plants for, for making tools, for preparing food, even for hunting in some cases. So, given that we depend on plants for so many different purposes, it kind of makes a functional sense that we wouldn't feel disgust necessarily toward a plant. I
Right.
mean, you do want to feel caution and a certain amount of fear about, not engaging with the plant in a way that might make you sick. But it seems like disgust might be too coarse-grained of an emotion to apply to plants because you don't want to necessarily avoid the plant at all times and keep your distance from it in every way possible. You might just want to avoid eating it, say, or engaging with a particular part of it, say, but you might want to use it for these other purposes. So it may be that there's a reason why disgust is not coming online when it comes to plants, and it's more of just a kind of caution or
Right.
fear. Have you thought about that in any way?
Yeah, I have, and I think you're right. I think I mean, so to preface this by we have not tested this yet, so to
Mhm.
try to distinguish between these things empirically. But what my the way that I think about it is that what makes sense for plants is basically just an avoidance,
Yeah.
right? It's not, I mean, watching the kids, it looks like boredom. It
Hmm.
looks like they kind of want to do anything else other than be there. They're like curious, but they're looking at the person, but it's
Hmm.
not like I don't see any evidence of them exhibiting a disgust reaction to plants. I also don't think that fear per se is necessarily involved because
Hmm.
fear seems like the kind of thing that you would want to have for like a snake or a spider, something that you need to like get up and
Yeah.
move away from. It's
Right.
not clear that being afraid of a plant per se is necessary. It really,
Hmm.
I think, this is why I talk about it as an avoidance mechanism. It really
Yeah.
is just, as far as I am aware, it's an avoidance, right? It's like
Yeah.
and a caution, right? And
Yeah.
particularly as you say, there's different parts of a plant. So there there's lots of plants that you have like raspberries or blackberries or any of those kind of brambly plants. You have to be very careful with how
Yeah.
you go in and pick those fruits, but the fruits themselves you don't have to be cautious of. But the broader plant you have to exhibit caution around.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost a distinct emotion. Like it's not disgust, it's not fear. It
Hmm.
really is this caution state.
Hmm.
And it would be interesting to look at that as a distinct
Mm.
emotional
Yeah.
profile and how
Yeah.
it could be differentiated from fear and disgust.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
a good
totally
point. Yeah.
agree. I totally agree. And I mean, I think in taking kind of a step back and thinking about the broader thing with plant learning, the way I think about that is that it's going to likely be a largely observational system, right?
Hmm.
So especially with what the literature says about the way that kind of teaching unfolds in small scale societies is, this is some of the work of people like Michelle Klein, but you you don't see necessarily explicit teaching. You don't see a lot of the kind of pedagogical stance that you
Mm.
see is certainly in the way we do things in the U.S. And in other kind of westernized cultures, for lack of a better term. Um, but instead, what you see is that there's often kind of subtle changes that people make when they know they have a naive learner who's there observing them.
Mhm.
And so it could be that in some cases, maybe for some of the things around food preparation or around artifact building, you would have kids just observing what the adults or the older kids are doing when they're making these things. They're not really being taught in any sort of specific way, but maybe the person is kind of adjusting a little bit. The model is kind of adjusting a little bit what they're doing. If it's a
Mhm.
foraging thing and a baby's along, maybe the people who are going foraging aren't bothering to do anything differently, but the baby's still there. And so you can have the learning systems kind of like kind of zero in on the relevant information, right? And that was a lot of the basis behind why I was testing, are they particularly vigilant for pick something off of a plant and eat it? Like, because I think these are probably largely observational systems and it's not adults or older kids sitting around being like, look, this is what you do with this. First you do this, first you do that. Instead, there's people living their lives and doing these things. And it's a young learner's problem, basically, to key in on what's
Mm,
happening and figure it out themselves and practice it and in safe ways. Um, yeah.
interesting. Yeah. There's a
So
whole
I mean,
like,
oh,
yeah,
that's what sorry. I realized I don't think you necessarily need a lot of emotion with that, right?
Hmm.
So I don't think you necessarily need like big like or like
Right.
or big like disgust. Maybe it
Yeah.
happens, and certainly I bet plants are bitter, right? The toxins in
Yeah.
them are bitter. So I'm sure there would be. I'm sure you would. We haven't done it yet. We should. We haven't done it yet where somebody tastes something that's like,
Yeah.
but you would expect there might be vigilance for that. But I don't know that you need disgust
Yeah.
as the input. I mean, certainly our work suggests that you don't. It just seems to be, as far as we can tell, it seems to be sort of the default response before there's social information.
right.
Hmm.
Yeah. Fear
Yeah,
is sort of like you're far, oh, sorry, David, you're like kind of
yeah,
far into it. So like if you,
totally.
if you're like you've eaten a bunch and all of a sudden you realize you use the poisonous plant, you might get afraid, right? But that's
Yeah.
different, like that's a different function. Or like you're far into a forest and you realize there's no way out and you become afraid. Like that's engaging that. But that's sort of incidental that it's plants, but it's for like, as you said, Annie, it's like for this additional motivating, like get out of this situation. And typically plants, it's sort of you don't get all that far in if everything is going right and you don't need those emotions exactly. And David, I love the idea of sort of this cautionary distinct category. Yeah.
I think, yeah, it could very well be its own distinct emotion with its distinct design features, and that it prompts attention to parts rather than
Yeah.
wholes and
Yeah.
procedures, and where,
Yep.
and prompts a greater attention toward, how other people are
Yep.
reacting to it, and social learning. So, yeah, it's an interesting underexplored topic, but,
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, because, since long before we were humans, this was a problem, right? So
yeah,
having a motivational system that kind of shifts everything, all the necessary different other systems into the right setting when you're engaging with it makes a lot of
yeah.
sense, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, but I can barely convince a lot of people that there should be any psychology for plants. I think convincing them that there might be a separate emotional component for plants would be
Yeah,
that's a lift, but that's something,
yeah.
I mean, that would be cool.
Right.
Hmm.
And so it sounds like, I mean, I mean, we've David and I have talked a lot about too, about not sort of like overselling results from studies or telling people what to do. Like I think we have to be humble about we don't know a lot. But it sounds like what you're saying that as much as possible, like expose kids to food preparation
Yeah.
and the fact that they're not getting that. And there's like this whole category of like, plant interactions of like cooking like on YouTube. If you just like there's all these things of like people building
Mhm.
houses out of like plants and people watch this or like cooking shows or right like or just the people love watching like people make stuff. And I wonder if to
Yep.
some extent that's sort of like a readout of the psychology that's not getting the relevant cues for those of us who are not in a place where people are sort of physically interacting with the environment as much.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think so. As you say, you don't want to overread stuff, but I think that's right. And I mean, you know, one of the reasons that I'm interested in following up more on this food learning thing is because in an ideal world, I'd be able to identify kind of what are these relevant cues, and then how could we find ways of, we're not going back to we're not going back to a small scale world in all likelihood. But how could we provide aspects of those cues to toddlers, to infants, to young kids in ways that could help to get them over some of this very reasonable reluctance
Right.
towards the what turn out to be the healthiest foods,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that's next on the list, is to really start digging into what that is. Um, and yeah, we'll see. I mean, I've done a little bit of doing some gardening program stuff, which was a big task, but fun to do. And I think there's a world where you could imagine like ways of designing things that you could potentially target the design of these systems to get you kind of the biggest bang for your buck in these
Right.
kinds of systems.
Right. Let the
Um,
kids play in the dirt and plant some
yeah,
plants.
exactly.
Yeah.
And let them see where their food is coming from. And I mean, this is Camille Ryu, my former postdoc, now collaborator. She has some work from her PhD actually showing that some of this food neophobia stuff seems may be the result of having less or more immature categorization abilities. So if you have a harder time knowing that the thing that you are encountering is in fact the same kind of thing you've encountered before, you
Uh,
are more likely to show neophobia. So if
oh,
if your
interesting. That's a smart
categorization
design.
abilities
Yeah.
are, yeah, right.
Yeah.
If your categorization
Interesting.
abilities, if you score highly on categorization abilities, you're less likely to exhibit
Mm.
neophobia in some of her studies. So
That's
this is why, yeah, I mean, David, maybe
yeah.
you're just cutting the vegetables the wrong way for your daughter.
Honestly, I think that might be it. Yeah, I'm cutting them in the wrong shape or something because
You
Hmm.
gotta
she
Yep.
does have a hard time. Like when we're eating tortilla chips, I remember I have this memory of she had a meltdown because she was upset that I ate the specific tortilla chip that she wanted.
Right.
mm,
Where she
right.
wasn't just saying they were all the same kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yep.
It was
Mm,
they were distinct tortilla chips, and she had her eye on that particular tortilla chips, which
yes.
Yeah.
suggests that she's having a hard time like treating it as a general category of the
Yeah.
same type of thing, and that could be driving
Right.
this. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, food is one of those things like we
yeah,
look at it, this is a big instinct blindness thing,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
Like we look
yeah,
at it and it's very clearly food. And why can't you see that it's food? But if you
yeah,
step back from it, it's just piles of shapes and colors and
yeah,
like textures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And why
yeah.
should that be food and not something else?
Yeah,
Right?
she
Yeah.
wanted the one that was a particular shape of a triangle and not the one that was
Hmm.
a different shape. Like she was paying attention
Yep.
to details that I completely ignored that, make sense if you're trying to figure out how the world works. Like it's not obvious what details are worth paying attention to. Um,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
Hmm.
Build a robot that can identify food. That's the yeah.
yeah.
Uh, but one of the questions we always ask people is there any question we should have asked you?
Oh, phew. I don't know. I feel like you got them all. Um, yeah. Well, I mean, David sort of alluded to, did I slip on a plant? And there is one like big plant experience that I did have
Oh,
as a child that probably, so the big plant experience as a child is I accidentally climbed up a poison oak vine, not
oh no.
knowing that it was poison oak, and got huge poison oak rash on my face. It was like summer, so it was along my legs, my whole body, and got a really, really, really terrible rash. So I learned firsthand that plants can be really dangerous and really unpleasant, and that you might not want to touch them.
That's a great origin story.
Hmm.
Poison Oak would be a great supervillain name for you, where you
Oh
use your
my
That's
plant
gosh.
great.
knowledge.
That's great. It's also a good
Poison
like
Oak strikes again.
Yeah.
It's also a good like folk fusion band name, Poison Oak, sort of.
Oh yeah, totally.
Maybe a little bit of rocking out too. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to see the movie where you seek revenge on reviewer two by
As Poison
Oh
Oak.
man.
yeah, Poison Oak.
Reviewer two
Don't
suddenly
cross
gets very
Poison
itchy.
Oak. It's a really good superpower. Yeah, like
Yeah.
harnessing the power of plants. I mean, that's
Oh,
yeah.
man.
Who was saying, David? Do you remember? I think it was either Chris von Ruden or Ed Hagen was saying plants aren't your friends. It might have been. It was somebody who like was in the schmar, like in the forest, or like
Oh,
really
yeah.
just
No,
like
they
you
are not
really,
your friends.
yeah,
Yeah.
They're
or
little
if they
chemical
are, they're
weapons
so,
factories. I
yeah,
mean, really,
Yeah.
they are. That's how they defend themselves. This is what they've come up with. And they've come up with some very clever ways to do it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You've got to respect the plants.
Hmm.
hmm
Yeah, and
Respect plants.
yeah, yeah. So respect the adaptations and respect plants, and yeah. So yeah. But David, anything else?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground, and yeah, we harvested our insights, and we planted our seeds, and we I'll just keep rattling off
Keep
plant
Yeah,
going,
we're
keep
metaphors.
gonna.
going.
We're,
And now we're out
Yeah.
of time.
Ah,
oh.
Oh,
THYME.
The
Very
ooh, I
nice.
homonym, the
can't.
homonym. Those are, yeah, it's hard. It's harder to get those to convey across this acoustic modality,
Yeah, but
but yeah, no, thank you so much. And genuinely, like, personal bias aside, like the work that you're doing, it's extremely important, not only because you're uncovering a new area of adaptations people hadn't looked before, but because it's also an example of exactly what you said, like learning is not opposed to evolutionary and the connection to development. I mean, we had Deb Lieberman on. She was really excited about the special issue with development, on development.
Mhm.
And I think it comes back to the initial thing that David mentioned about what you were doing, which is that as a developmental psychologist, you were already asking like a good question, and evolutionary psychology answered it. And I do think that the connection between developmental and evolutionary approaches are very much kindred because in many cases developmentalists are asking, and you're nodding your head, so I
yeah.
suggest you agree, but yeah, because you have to sort of respect that there are systems that because they're kids, you have to really think about what's the cue structure. I think there's a lot of connections to integrating development evolutionary, and so thank you for doing that because I think it's really going to help keep both development and evolutionary psychology sort of invigorated and thriving and flourishing to tiptoe towards a plant pun.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. That means a lot. And I mean, I'm standing on shoulders of giants with all of this stuff, and I appreciate that, and I hope that people who are interested in development and evolution, I'm going to be looking for grad students for the next many years to come in this
Mhm.
lab and research assistants. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, keep an eye out for me and my work, and hopefully we can bring development and evolutionary approaches closer together.
Yeah, the lab name, it's a relatively new lab name. What is the lab?
The Lab for Infant Learning and Cognition, or LILAC.
Oh, cool.
Boom. Yeah.
Mm,
Nice.
plant puns.
All right.
Yeah. Top that. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much, both of you, for having me on. This is a real pleasure. It's great to talk to you, even though I get to talk to one of you every day, but this is a different
Yeah.
format.
No, exactly. But
And
we
this has
don't
been a
often
lot of
get to
fun.
talk.
So
Yeah.
thank
Yep.
you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. All right.
All right. David, we have ended another episode, this one full of the weird combination of babies and plants.
Yes. It was a wild ride. Um, a lot of seeds were planted. A
Ooh.
lot of flowers of insight bloomed.
And it
Uh,
was but now it's time to end the episode.
OTHYME.
Yeah,
Okay.
again, a
Very good. I see
homonym.
what you
Yeah.
did there.
Homonyms really don't come across on podcasts. I really have to work.
No,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
the ideal format.
Yeah.
But if you want to support us, please leave us a kind review, give us some feedback, tell us what you want to hear, who you want to listen to, what topics you want us to cover. If you're so inclined, you can support us on Patreon. Anything else people can do, Dave?
Just, look up interesting, important work in evolutionary social sciences. And if you come across stuff that we should cover, let us know.
Yeah, please do.
All right. We'll see you guys next week.
See ya.